and strange besides. But Bale threw back his head and laughed. The wetlands turn everything on its head, Davram Bashir. A curious gesture of his right hand brought the other Aiel to their feet, and they loped off eastward in long, easy strides. The snow did not seem to give them any difficulty. Sliding his looking glass into the leather case hanging from Quick's saddle bow, Bashir mounted and turned the bay west. His own escort had been waiting on the reverse slope, and they fell in behind him with only the faint creak of leather and never a jingle of unsecured metal. They numbered fewer than Bale's escort, but they were tough men from his estates at Tyre, and he had led them into the Blight many times before bringing them south. Every man had his assigned part of the trail to watch, ahead or behind, left or right, high or low, and their heads swiveled constantly. He hoped they were not just going through the motions. The forest was sparse here, every branch bare except an oak and leatherleaf, pine and fir, but the snow-covered land rolled so that 100 mounted men could be 50 paces away and unseen. Not that he expected any such thing, but then, what killed you was always what you never expected. Unconsciously, he eased his sword in its scabbard. You just had to expect the unexpected. Head command of the escort, as he did most days, Bashir did not have something more important for the young lieutenant to do. Bashir was grooming him. He could think clearly and see beyond what was in front of him. He was destined for higher rank if he lived longer. A tall man, if a couple of hands shorter than Bale, today he wore disgruntlement on his face like a second nose. What troubles you, Tumad? The Aielman was right, my lord. Tumad tugged angrily at his thick black beard with a gauntleted fist. These Andorans spit at our feet. I do not like having to ride away while they thumb and ear at us. Well, he was still young. You find our situation boring, perhaps? Bashir laughed. You need more excitement? Zenobia is only 50 leagues north of us, and if rumor can be believed, she brought Atheniella of Kandor, and Pytar of Arafel, and even that Shinar and Isar with her. All the might of the borderlands come looking for us, Tumad. Those Andorans down in Murundi don't like us being in Andor either, so I hear. And if that Aes Sedai army they're facing doesn't chop them to pieces, or hasn't already, they may come looking for us. So may the Aes Sedai, for that matter, sooner or later. We've ridden for the Dragon Reborn, and I can't see any sister forgiving that. And then there are the Shongshan, Tumad. Do you really think we've seen the last of them? They will come to us, or we will have to go to them. One or the other is sure. You young men don't know excitement when it's crawling in your mustache. Quiet chuckles rippled through the men following, men as old as Bashir himself for the most part, and even Tumad flashed white teeth through his beard in a grin. They had all been on campaign before, if never one so odd as this. Straightening around, Bashir watched the way through the trees, but with only half his attention. In all truth, Zenobia did worry him. The Light only knew why Isar and the others had decided to leave the Blight border together, much less strip away as many soldiers as Hearsay said they had brought south. Even Hearsay divided by half. Doubtless they had reasons they considered good and sufficient, and doubtless Zenobia shared them. But he knew her, taught her to ride, watched her grow up, presented her the broken crown when she took the throne. She was a good ruler, neither too heavy-handed nor too light, intelligent if not always wise, brave without being foolhardy, but impulsive was a mild description of her. Sometimes hot-headed was mild. And he was as sure as he could be that she had her own goal, aside from whatever they aimed at. The head of Davram Bashir. If that was so, she was unlikely to settle for another period of exile after coming this far. The longer Zenobia worried a bone in her teeth, the harder it was to convince her to give it up. It was a neat problem. She should be in Saldaea, guarding the Blight border, but so should he. She could convict him of treason twice over, at least, for what he had done since coming south, but he still could see no other way to have gone. Rebellion, Zenobia could define that loosely when she chose. Rebellion was horrible to contemplate, yet he wanted his head firmly attached to his neck a while longer. A neat and thorny problem. The encampment containing the 8,000-odd light cavalry he had left after Ilion and fighting the Shongshan spread wider than the camp back on the Tarbalan Road, but it could not be said to sprawl. The horse lines were uniform rows, with a farrier's forge at either end, stretched between equally straight rows of large gray or shell-white tents, though those showed a good many patches now. Every man could be mounted and ready to fight inside a count of 50 from a trumpet signal, and his sentries were placed to make sure they had that count and more. Even the camp followers' tents and wagons, 100 paces south of the rest, were more orderly than the soldiers besieging the city, as though they had followed the example of the Saldaeans. Somewhat, at least. As he rode in with his escort, men moved quickly and grimly among the horse lines, almost as if the signal to mount had been sounded. More than one had his sword drawn. Voices called to him, but at the sight of a large crowd of men and women, mostly women, gathered in the center of the camp, he felt a sudden numbness inside. He dug in his heels, and Quick sprang forward at a gallop. He did not know whether anyone followed him or not. He heard nothing but the blood pounding in his ears, saw nothing but the crowd in front of his own sharp-peaked tent, the tent he shared with Dira. He did not rein in on reaching the crowd, just threw himself out of the saddle and hit the ground running. He heard people speak without taking in what they were saying. They parted in front of him, opening a path to his tent, or he would have run over them. Just inside the tent flaps, he halted. The tent, large enough for 20 soldiers to sleep in, was crowded to the walls with women, wives of nobles and officers, but his eyes quickly found his own wife, Dira, seated on a folding chair in the middle of the carpets that served for a floor, and the numbness faded. He knew she would die one day. They both would. But the only thing he feared was living without her. Then he realized that some of the women were helping her to lower her dress to her waist. Another was pressing a folded cloth to Dira's left arm, and the cloth was growing red as blood ran down her arm in a sheet and dripped from her fingers into a bowl set on the carpet. There was a considerable amount of dark blood already in the bowl. She saw him at the same instant, and her eyes flashed in a face that was much too pale. "It comes from hiring outlanders, husband," she said fiercely, her right hand shaking a long dagger at him. As tall as most men, inches taller than he, and beautiful, her face framed with raven hair, winged with white, she had a commanding presence that could become imperious when she was angry, even when she obviously could barely sit upright. Most women would have been flustered at being bare to the waist in front of so many, with her husband present. Not Dira. "If you did not always insist on moving like the wind, we could have good men from our own estates to do whatever was needful." "A dispute with servants, Dira," he said, cocking an eyebrow. "I never thought you'd start taking knives to them." Several of the women gave him cool, sidelong glances. Not every man and wife dealt together as he and Dira did. Some thought them odd, since they seldom shouted. Dira scowled at him, then grunted a short, involuntary laugh. "I will start at the beginning, Davram, and go slowly so you can understand," she added with a small smile, pausing to thank the woman who draped a white linen sheet around her bare torso. "I returned from my ride to find 2 strange men ransacking our tent. They drew daggers, so naturally I hit one of them with a chair and stabbed the other." She directed a grimace at her cut arm. "Not well enough, since he managed to touch me. Then Xavian and some of the others came in, and the pair fled through a slit they had made in the rear of the tent." Several of the women nodded grimly and gripped the hilts of the daggers they all wore, until Dira said darkly, "I told them to give chase, but they insisted on tending my scratch." Hands dropped away from hilts, and faces colored, though none looked in the least apologetic for disobeying. They had been in a ticklish position. Dira was their liege lady as he was their liege lord, but whether or not she called it a scratch, she could have bled to death if they had left her to go chasing the thieves. "In any event," she went on, "I ordered a search. They won't be hard to find. One has a lump on his head and the other is bleeding." She gave a sharp, satisfied nod. Xavian, the sinewy red-haired lady of Gahar, held up a threaded needle. "Unless you have taken up an interest in embroidery, my lord," she said coolly, "may I suggest that you withdraw?" Bashir acquiesced with a small bow of his head. Dira never liked him to watch her being sewn up. He never liked watching her being sewn up. Outside the tent, he paused to announce in a loud voice that his lady wife was well and being tended, and that they should all go on about their business. The men departed with wishes for Dira's well-being, but none of the women stirred a foot. He did not press them. They would remain until Dira herself appeared, whatever he said, and a wise man tried to avoid battles he would not only lose, but look foolish losing. It was waiting on the edge of the crowd, and he fell in beside Bashir, who walked with his hands clasped tightly behind his back. He had been expecting this, or something like, for a long time, but he had almost begun to think it would not happen, and he had never expected Dira to nearly die because of it. "The 2 men have been found, my lord," Tumot said. "At least, they apparently meet the description the Lady Dira gave." Bashir's head jerked around, murder on his face, and the younger man quickly added, "They were dead, my lord, just outside the camp. Each got one thrust with a narrow blade." He stabbed a finger at the base of his skull, just behind the ear. "It had to be more than one, did it? Unless he was faster than a rock viper." Bashir nodded. The price of failure often was death. 2 to search, and how many to silence them? How many remained? And how long before they tried again? Worst of all, who was behind it? The White Tower? The Forsaken? It seemed a decision had been reached for him. No one except Dumad was close enough to hear him, but he spoke softly anyway, and chose his words cautiously. Sometimes the price of carelessness was death, too. "You know where to find the man who came to me yesterday. Find him, and tell him I agree. But there will be a few more than we talked about."
Feathery snow falling on the city of Kyrian dimmed the morning sunlight only a little, just muting the brightness. From the tall, narrow window in the Sun Palace, fitted with a casement of good glass panes against the cold, Samitsu could see clearly the wooden scaffolding erected around the ruined section of the palace, broken cubes of dark stone still littered with rubble, and stepped towers that stopped abruptly short of equaling the rest of the palace's towers. One, the Tower of the Risen Sun, was simply no longer there. Several of the city's fabled topless towers loomed through the drifting white flakes, enormous square spires with huge buttresses, much taller by far than any in the palace, despite its location on the highest hill in a city of hills. They were wrapped in their own scaffolds, and still not completely rebuilt 20 years after the Aiel had burned them. Another 20 might see them done. There were no workmen clambering along the planks on any of the scaffolding, of course, not in this weather. She found herself wishing the snow could give her a hand, too. When Catswain departed a week past, leaving her in charge, her task had appeared straightforward. Make sure the Kyrianan pot did not begin to boil again. That had appeared a simple task at the time, though she had seldom dabbled in politics to speak of. Only one noble retained sizable forces under arms, and Dobrain was cooperative for the most part, seeming to want everything kept quiet. Of course, he had accepted that fool appointment as Steward of Kyrian for the Dragon Reborn. The boy had named a Steward of Tyr, too, a man who had been in rebellion against him a month gone. If he had done as much in Ilion, it seemed all too probable. Those appointments would cause no end of trouble for Sister to sort out before all was said and done. The boy brought nothing but trouble. Yet so far, Dobrain seemed to be using his new post only to run the city, and to quietly rally support for Elaine Trakan's claim to the Sun Throne, if she ever made one. Samitsu was satisfied to leave it at that, not caring one way or another who took the Sun Throne. She did not care much for Kyrian at all. The falling snow beyond her window swirled in a gust of wind like a white kaleidoscope. So tranquil. Had she ever valued tranquility before? She certainly could not recall it if she had. Neither the possibility of Elaine Trakand taking the throne, nor Dobrain's new title had brought nearly as much inclination as the ridiculous and ridiculously persistent rumors about the poor boy going to Tar Valon, though she had not quell those. That tale had everyone from nobles to stablemen half afraid to breathe, which was very well and good for maintaining the peace. The game of houses had been to a halt, compared to how matters were in Kyrian. The Aiel who came into the city from their huge camp a few miles east very likely helped, however much they were hated by the general run of folk. Everyone knew they followed the Dragon Reborn, and no one wanted to risk finding themselves on the wrong end of thousands of Aiel's spears. Young Althor was much more useful absent than present. Rumors out of the west of Aiel raiding elsewhere, looting, burning, killing indiscriminately, so merchants' hearsay claimed, gave people a to step gingerly with those here. In fact, there seemed to be no burrs to prick Kyrian out of its quiet, aside from the occasional street brawl between four-gators and city folk, who considered the noisy, brightly clad four-gators as alien as the Aiel, and a good deal safer to fight. The city was crowded to the attics, with people sleeping anywhere they could find shelter from the cold. Yet food supplies were more than adequate, if not overabundant, and certainly better than expected in winter. All in all, she should have felt content that she was carrying out Cadsuane's instructions as well as the Green could wish for, except that Cadsuane would expect more. She always did. Are you listening to me, Samitsu? Sighing, Samitsu turned from the peaceful view through the window, taking pains not to smooth her yellow-slashed skirts. The jacanda-made silver bells in her hair tinkled faintly, but today the sound failed to soothe her. At the best of times, she did not feel entirely comfortable in her apartments in the palace, though a blazing fire in the wide marble fireplace gave a good warmth, and the bed in the next room had the best quality feather mattresses and goose-down pillows. All three of her rooms were overly ornate in the severe Kyrianan fashion, the white ceiling plaster worked in interlocking squares, the wide bar cornices heavily gilded, and the wooden wall panels polished to a soft glow, yet dark even so. The furnishings were darker still, and massively constructed, edged with thin lines of gold leaf and inlaid with patterned ivory wedges. The flowered Tyran carpet in this room seemed garishly disordered compared to everything else, and emphasized the surrounding stiffness. It all seemed too much like a cage of late. What really discomfited her, though, was the woman with her hair in ringlets to her shoulders, standing in the middle of the carpet, fists on her hips, a belligerent set to her chin, and a frown narrowing her blue eyes. Sachal wore the great serpent ring, of course, on her right hand, but also an Aiel necklace and bracelet, fat beads of silver and ivory intricately worked and carved, gaudy against her high-necked dress of brown wool, which was plain, if fine and well cut. Not crude pieces, certainly, but flamboyant, and hardly the sort a sister would wear. The oddity of that jewelry might hold the key to much, if Samitsu could ever find the reason behind it. The wise ones, especially Soralia, looked at her as if she were a fool for not knowing without asking, and refused to be bothered with answering. They did that all too often. Most especially Soralia. Samitsu was unused to being thought a fool, and she disliked it immensely. Not for the first time, she found it difficult to meet the other sister's gaze. Sachal was the major reason contentment eluded her, no matter how well everything was going otherwise. Most maddening, Sachal was a red, yet despite her Aja, she was oath-sworn to young Althor. How could any Aes Sedai swear fealty to anyone or anything other than the White Tower itself? How in the light could a red swear to a man who could channel? Maybe Varen had been right about Tavir and twisting chance. Samitsu could not begin to think of any other reason for 31 sisters, 5 of them red, to take such an oath. The Lady Ailiel has been approached by lords and ladies who represent most of House Riatan's strength, she replied, much more patiently than she felt. They want her to take the high seat of Riatan, and she wants White Tower approval. Aes Sedai approval, at least. For something to do besides match stares, and likely lose, she moved to a blackwood table where a gold-worked silver pitcher sitting on a silver tray still gave off the faint scent of spices. Filling a cup with mulled wine provided an excuse to break the fleeting eye contact. Needing an excuse made her replace the pitcher on the tray with a sharp clink. She found herself avoiding looking at Sachal too often. Even now she realized she was looking at the other woman sideways. To her frustration, she could not quite make herself turn completely to meet her stare. Tell her no, Sachal. Her brother was still alive when last seen, and rebellion against the Dragon Reborn is nothing that need concern the Tower. Certainly not now it's done with. The memory arose of Toram Riatan as last seen, running off into a strange fog that could take on solid form and kill. A fog that resisted the one power. The shadow had walked outside the walls of Kyrian that day. Samitsu's voice tightened from the effort to stop it short of trembling, not with fear, but anger. That had been the day she failed at healing young Althor. She hated failures, hated remembering them, and she should not have to explain herself. Most of Riatan's strength is not all. Those still tied to Toram will oppose her, with force of arms if necessary, and in any case fostering upheaval inside the houses themselves is no way to maintain the peace. There is a precarious balance in Kyrian now, Sashal, but it is a balance, and we mustn't disturb it. She managed to stop short of saying Cadsuane would be displeased if they did. That would hardly carry weight with Sashal. Upheaval will come whether or not we foster it, the other sister said firmly. Her frown had faded as soon as Samitsu showed she had been listening, though the set of her jaw remained. Perhaps it was stubbornness rather than belligerence, yet that hardly mattered. The other woman was not arguing or trying to convince her, just stating her own position, and most galling of all, plainly doing that much as a courtesy. The Dragon Reborn is the herald of upheaval and change, Samitsu. The herald foretold. And if he weren't, this is Kyrian. Do you think they have really stopped playing at Des Demar? The surface of the water may be still, but the fish never stop swimming. A red, preaching the Dragon Reborn like a street-corner demagogue. Light. And if you are wrong? In spite of herself, Samitsu bit off the words. Sashal, burn her, maintained a perfect serenity. Eileen has forsworn any claim to the Sun Throne in favor of Elaine Trakand, which is what the Dragon Reborn desires, and she is ready to swear fealty to him if I ask it. Toram led an army against Rand Althor. I say the change is worth making and the chance worth taking, and I will tell her so. The bells in Samitsu's hair chimed at an irritated shake of her head, and she barely managed to stop herself from sighing again. 18 of those dragon-sworn sisters remained in Kyrian. Cadsuane had carried some away with her, then sent Alana back to take off still more, and others of the 18 besides Sashal stood higher than she, but the Aiel wise ones kept them out of her way. In principle, she disapproved of how that was done. Aes Sedai could not be apprentices, not to anyone. It was outrageous, but in practice it did make her job easier. They could not meddle or try to take charge with wise ones running their lives and watching over their every hour. Unfortunately, for some reason she could not learn, the wise ones looked differently on Sashal and the other 2 sisters who had been stilled at Dumai's wells. Stilled. She felt a faint shiver at the thought, but only faint, and it would be less if she ever managed to work out how Dahmer Flynn had healed what could not be healed. At least someone could heal stilling, even if it was a man. A man channeling. Light. How the horror of yesterday became merely the uneasiness of today once you grew accustomed. She was sure that Cadsuane would have arranged matters with the wise ones before leaving, had she known about the difference with Sashala and Ergine and Ronila. At least, she thought she was sure. This was not the first time she had been pulled into one of the legendary Green's designs. Cadsuane could be more devious than a blue, schemes inside plots wrapped in stratagems and all hidden behind still others. Some were planned to fail in order to help others succeed, and only Cadsuane knew which were which. Not at all a comforting thought. In any case, those 3 sisters were free to come and go as they desired, do as they desired. And they certainly felt no need to follow the guidance Cadsuane had left behind, or to follow the sister she had named to lead. Only their mad oath to Althor guided or constrained them. Samitsu had never felt weak or ineffectual in her life, except when her talent failed her, yet she very much wished that Cadsuane would return and take matters out of her hands. A few words delivered in Ailil's ear would quench any desire the lady had to mount the high seat, of course, yet it would come to nothing unless she found some way to deflect Sashal from her purpose. No matter that Ailil feared having her silly secrets aired abroad. Inconsistency in what Aes Sedai told her could well make her decide it was better to try this in the country estates rather than her sister, whatever she did. Cadsuane would be upset over losing Ailil. Samitsu herself would be upset. Ailill was a conduit into half the plots brewing among the nobles, a gauge to be sure those intrigues were all still petty and unlikely to bring any major disturbance. The cursed Red knew that. And once Sashal gave Ailill this permission, it would be her the woman came running to with her news, not Samitsu Tamagawa. While Samitsu was floundering in her quandary, the door to the hallway opened to admit a pale, stern-faced Kyrianan woman, a hand shorter than either Aes Sedai. Her hair was in a thick gray roll on the nape of her neck, and she wore an unadorned gray dress so dark it was nearly black, the current livery of a Sun Palace servant. Servants never announced themselves or asked admittance, of course, but Corgaida Maran Devon was hardly just another servant. The heavy, silvery ring of long keys at her waist was a badge of office. Whoever ruled Cairhien, the holder of the keys ruled the Sun Palace in simple fact, and there was nothing submissive in Corgaida's manner. She made a minimal curtsy carefully aimed halfway between Samitsu and Sashal. "I was asked to report anything unusual," she said to the heir, though it had been Samitsu who asked. Very likely she had known of the power struggle between them as soon as they did themselves. Little in the palace escaped her. "I'm told there is an Ogier in the kitchens. He and a young man supposedly are looking after work as masons, but I have never heard of Ogier and human masons working together. And Stedding Tsofu sent word no masons would be available from any Stedding for the foreseeable future when we inquired after the incident." The pause was barely perceptible, and her grave expression did not alter, but half the gossip about the attack on the Sun Palace laid it to Althor's doing, the other to Aes Sedai. A few tales mentioned the Forsaken, but only to pair them with either Althor or the Aes Sedai. Her lips in thought, Samitsu set aside the cursed tangle Cairhienan made of everything they touched. Denials of Aes Sedai involvement did little good. The 3 oaths went only so far, in a city where a simple yes or no could give rise to 6 contradictory rumors. But Ogier. The palace kitchens scarcely took in stray passers-by, yet the cooks very likely would give an Ogier a hot meal just for the strangeness of seeing him. Ogier were even more uncommon than usual this last year or so. A few were still seen now and then, but walking as fast as only an Ogier could, and seldom stopping in one place more than long enough to sleep. They rarely traveled with humans, much less worked with them. The pairing tickled something in her mind, though. Hoping to tease whatever it was into the open, she opened to ask a few questions. "Thank you, Corgaida," Sashal said with a smile. "You've been most helpful. But if you will leave us now?" Being abrupt with the holder of the keys was a good way to find yourself with dirty bed linens and poorly spiced meals, unemptied chamber pots and messages that went astray, 1,000 annoyances that could make life a misery and leave you wading in mud trying to accomplish anything at all. Yet somehow that smile appeared to take the sting out of her words for Corgaida. The gray-haired woman bowed her head slightly in assent, and again made the smallest possible curtsy, this time obviously to Sashal. Nor had the door closed behind the gray-haired woman, then Samitsu thumped her silver cup back on the tray hard enough to splash warm wine over her wrist and rounded on the Red Sister. She was on the brink of losing control of Ailill, and now the Sun Palace itself appeared to be slipping through her fingers. It was as likely Corgaida would sprout wings and fly as keep silent about what she had seen here, and whatever she said would flash through the palace and infect every servant down to the men who mucked out the stables. That final curtsy had made it quite clear what she thought. Light, but Samitsu hated Cairhien. The customs of civility between sisters were deeply ingrained, but Sashal did not stand high enough to make her hold her tongue in the face of this disaster, and she intended to deliver the rough side of it. Frowning at the other woman, though, she saw Sashal's face, really saw it, perhaps for the first time, and suddenly she knew why it troubled her so. perhaps even why she had found it difficult to look directly at the Red Sister. It was no longer an Aes Sedai face, outside of time and standing apart from age. Most people were unsure of the look until it was pointed out, but it was unmistakable to another sister. Perhaps some bits remained, scraps that made Sashal appear closer to beautiful than she really was, yet anyone at all would put an age to her, somewhere short of her middle years. The realization froze Samitsu's tongue. What was known about women who had been stilled was little better than rumor. They ran away and hid from other sisters. Eventually, they died. Usually they died soon rather than late. The loss of Saidar was more than most women could bear for very long. But it was all really tittle-tattle. As far as she knew, no one in a very long time had had the nerve to try learning more. The rarely acknowledged fear in the darkest corner of every sister's head that the same fate might come to her one day in a careless moment kept anyone from wanting to know too much. Even Aes Sedai could hide their eyes when they did not want to see. There were always those rumors, though, almost never mentioned, and so vague you could never recall where you heard them first. Whispers on the edge of hearing, yet forever floating about. One that Samitsu had only half remembered, till now, said that a woman who was stilled grew young again, if she lived. It had always seemed ludicrous, till now. Regaining the ability to channel had not given Sashal back everything. Once more she would have to work with the power for years to gain the face that would proclaim her Aes Sedai to any sister who could see her clearly. Or would she regain it? It seemed inevitable, yet this was unmapped terrain. And if her face was changed, was anything else about her changed as well? Samitsu shivered, harder than she had for the thought of stilling. Perhaps it was as well she had gone slow in trying to puzzle out Dahmer's way of healing. Bring her Aiel necklace, Sashal seemed unaware that Samitsu had any grievance, unaware of Samitsu's scrutiny. This may be nothing, or it may warrant looking into, she said. But Korgaida was only reporting what she heard. If we want to learn anything, we must go and see for ourselves. Without another word, she gathered her skirts and started out of the apartments, leaving Samitsu only a choice between following or remaining behind. It was intolerable, yet remaining was unthinkable. Hal was no taller than she, not to speak of, but she had to hurry to keep up as the Red glided swiftly along wide, square-vaulted corridors. Taking the lead was out of the question unless she chose to run. She fumed in silence, although it required gritting her teeth. Arguing with another sister in public was improper at best. Worse, without any doubt, it would be futile, and that would only dig the hole she was in deeper. She felt a very great desire to kick something. Stand lamps at regular intervals gave plenty of light, even in the darkest stretches of hallway, but there was little color or decoration beyond the occasional tapestry, with everything in it arranged in orderly fashion, whether animals being hunted or nobles fighting gallantly in battle. A few niches in the walls held ornaments of gold or seafolk porcelain, and in some corridors the cornices were worked in friezes, most left unpainted. That was all. Kyrian hid their opulence out of public view, as they did with so much. The serving men and women who hurried industriously along the halls like streams of ants wore livery the color of charcoal, except for those in service to nobles resident in the palace, who seemed bright beside the rest, with their house badges embroidered on their breasts, and their collars and sometimes sleeves marked in house colors. One or two even had a coat or dress all in house colors, and appeared almost an outlander among the others. But they all kept their eyes down and barely paused long enough to offer quick bows or curtsies to the two sisters as they passed. The Sun Palace required countless hundreds of servants, and it seemed they were all scurrying about this morning, tending their chores. Nobles strolled in the hallways too, offering their own cautious courtesies to the Aes Sedai as they passed, perhaps with a greeting carefully balanced between an illusion of equality and the true state of affairs, spoken in low voices that did not carry far. They proved the old saying that strange times make for strange traveling companions. Old enmities had been put away in the face of new dangers, for the moment. Here 2 or 3 pale Kyrianan lords in dark silk coats with thin stripes of color across the front, some with the fronts of their heads shaved and powdered soldier fashion, promenaded alongside an equal number of dark Tyrans, taller in their bright coats with fat striped sleeves. There a Tyran noblewoman in a snug pearl-sewn cap, colorfully brocaded gown, and pale lace ruff walked arm in arm beside a shorter Kyrianan noble with her hair in an elaborate tower that reached well above her companion's head, smoky gray lace under her chin, and narrow stripes of her house colors cascading down the front of her wide-skirted dark silk, all like bosom friends and distant confidants. Some pairings did look odder than others. A number of women had begun wearing outlandish clothes of late, apparently never noticing how they drew men's eyes and made even the servants struggle not to stare. Tight breeches and a coat barely long enough to cover the hips were not suitable garments for a woman, no matter how much effort went into embroidery or patterning the coat with strings. Jewel necklaces and bracelets and pins with strings of colorful feathers only pointed up the oddity, and those brightly dyed boots, with their heels that added as much as a hand to a woman's height, made them appear in danger of falling down with every swaying step. Scandalous, Sachal muttered, eyeing one such pair of women and twitching her skirts in displeasure. Scandalous, Samitsu murmured before she could stop herself, then snapped her mouth shut so hard her teeth clicked. She needed to control her tongue. Voicing agreement just because she agreed was a habit she could ill afford with Sachal. Still, she could not help glancing back at the pair in disapproval and a bit of wonder. A year ago, Alina Truliandred and Fionda Anaris would have been at each other's throats, or rather have had their armsmen at one another's throats. But then who would have expected to see Bertoma Saigon walking peacefully with Weramon Saniago, neither man reaching for the dagger at his belt? Strange times and strange traveling companions. Doubtless they were playing the game of houses, maneuvering for advantage as they always had, yet dividing lines that once were graven in stone now turned out to have been drawn on water instead. Very strange times. The kitchens were on the lowest level of the Sun Palace above ground, at the back, a cluster of stone-walled, beamed-ceiling rooms centered around a long windowless room full of iron stoves and brick ovens and dressed stone fireplaces, and the heat was enough to make anyone forget the snow outside, or even that it was winter. Normally sweaty-faced cooks and undercooks, as darkly clad as any other palace servants beneath their white aprons, would have been scurrying about getting ready to prepare a midday meal, kneading loaves on long flour-strewn tables topped with marble, basting the joints and fowl that were turning on spits in the fireplaces. Now only the trotting spit dogs were moving, eager to earn their bits from the joints. Baskets of turnips and carrots stood unpeeled and unchopped, and smells sweet and spicy came from untended pots of sauces. Even the scullions, boys and girls surreptitiously wiping their faces on their aprons, stood on the fringe of a group of women clustered around one of the tables. From the doorway, Samitsu could see the back of an Ogier's head rising above them where he was seated at the table, taller than most men would have been standing up, and broad with it. Of course, Kyrianan were short by and large, and that helped. She laid a hand on Sachal's arm, and for a wonder the woman stopped with a resolute protest. "Vanished without leaving a clue where he was going?" the Ogier was asking in a deep rumble like the earth shifting, his long tufted ears sticking up through dark hair that hung to his high collar, flicked back and forth uneasily. "Oh, do stop talking about him, Master Ladar," a woman's voice answered, in a quaver that seemed well practiced. "Wicked he was. Tore half the palace apart with the one power he did. He could turn your blood to ice just looking at you and kill you as soon as look. Thousands have died by his own hand. Tens of thousands. Oh, I never liked talking about him. For someone who never likes talking about something, Eldred Methin, another woman said sharply. You surely talk of little else. Stout and quite tall for a Kyrianan, nearly as tall as Samitsu herself, with a few strands of gray hair escaping her white plain-lace cap, she must have been the chief cook on duty, because everyone Samitsu could see quickly nodded agreement and twittered with laughter and said, "Oh, right you are, Mistress Beldair," in a particularly sycophantic way. Servants had their own hierarchies, as rigidly maintained as the tower itself. But that sort of thing really is not for us to be gossiping over, Master Ladar, the stout woman went on. Aes Sedai business, that is, and not for the likes of you and me. Tell us more about the borderlands. Have you really seen Trollocs? Aes Sedai, a man muttered. Hidden by the crowd around the table, he had to be Ladar's companion. Samitsu could see no grown men among the kitchen folk this morning. Tell me, do you really think they bonded those men you were talking about? Those Ashaman, as warders? And what about the one who died? You never said how. Why, it was the Dragon Reborn as killed him, Eldred piped up. And what else would Aes Sedai bond a man as? Oh, terrible they was, them Ashaman. Turn you to stone with a look they could. You can tell one just by looking at him, you know. Frightful, glowing eyes they have. Be quiet, Eldred, Mistress Beldair said firmly. Maybe they was Ashman and maybe not, Master Underhill. Maybe they was bonded and maybe not. All I or anyone else can say is they was with him. The emphasis in her voice made plain who she was talking about. Eldred might consider Randall Thor fearful, but this woman did not want to so much as name him. And soon after he left, suddenly the Aes Sedai was telling them what to do and they was doing it. Of course, any fool knows to do as an Aes Sedai says. Anyway, those fellers are all gone off now. Why are you so interested in them, Master Underhill? Is that an Andoran name? Ladar threw back his head and laughed, a booming sound that filled the room. His ears twitched violently. Oh, we want to know everything about the places we visit, Mistress Beldair. The borderlands, you say? You might think it's cold here, but we've seen trees crack open like nuts on the fire from the cold in the borderlands. You have blocks of ice in the river floating down from upstream, but we've seen rivers as wide as the Alguenya frozen so merchants can drive loaded trains of wagons across them, and men fishing through holes cut in ice nearly a span thick. At night there are sheets of light in the sky that seem to crackle, bright enough to dim the stars, and even Mistress Beldair was leaning toward the Ogier, caught up. But one of the young scullions, too short to see past the adults, glanced behind him, and his eyes went wide when they lit on Samitsu and Sashal. His gaze stayed fixed on them as if trapped, but he fumbled with one hand till he could tug at Mistress Beldair's sleeve. The first time she shook him off without looking around. At a second tug, she turned her head with a scowl that vanished in a blink when she, too, saw the Aes Sedai. Grace favor you, Aes Sedai, she said, hastily tucking stray hair back under her cap as she bobbed her curtsy. How may I serve you? Ladar broke off short in mid-sentence, and his ears stiffened for a moment. He did not look toward the doorway. We wish to speak with your visitors, Sashal said, moving into the kitchen. We won't disrupt your kitchen for long. Of course, Aes Sedai. If the stout woman felt any surprise at two sisters wanting to talk to kitchen visitors, she showed none. Head swinging from side to side to take in everyone, she clapped her plump hands and began spouting orders. Eldred, those turnips will never peel themselves. Who was watching the fig sauce? Dried figs are hard to come by. Where is your basting spoon, Casey? Andil, run, fetch some. Cooks and scullions scattered in every direction, and the clatter of pots and spoons quickly filled the kitchen, though everyone was plainly making an effort to be as quiet as possible so as not to disturb the Aes Sedai. They were plainly making an effort not to even look in their direction, though that involved some contortion. The Ogier rose to his feet smoothly, his head coming near the thick ceiling beams. His clothing was what Samitsu remembered from meeting Ogier before, a long dark coat that flared over turned-down boots. Stains on his coat said he'd been traveling hard. Ogier were a fastidious people. He only half turned to face her and Sashal even as he made a bow, and he rubbed at his wide nose as if it itched, partially hiding his broad face, but he appeared young for an Ogier.
"Forgive us, Aes Sedai," he murmured, "but we really must be moving on."
Bending to gather a huge leather scrip that had a large rolled blanket tied across the top and showed the impressions of several square shapes packed around whatever else was stuffed inside, he hoisted the broad strap over one shoulder. His capacious coat pockets bulged with angular shapes, too.
"We have a long way to go before nightfall."
His companion remained seated, though, his hands spread on the tabletop. A pale-haired young man with a week's growth of beard who seemed to have slept more than one night in his rumpled brown coat. He watched the Aes Sedai warily, with dark eyes that belonged on a cornered fox. "Where are you going that you can reach by nightfall?" Sashal did not stop until she was standing in front of the young Ogier, close enough to need to crane her neck to look up at him, though she made it seem graceful rather than awkward, as it should have been. "Are you on your way to the meeting we've heard about? In Steading Shangtai? Master Ladar, is it?" His tall ears twitched violently, then were still, and his teacup-sized eyes narrowed almost as warily as the young man's, till the dangling ends of his eyebrows trailed onto his cheeks.
"Ladar, son of Shandin, son of Koimal, Aes Sedai," he said reluctantly. "But I'm certainly not going to the Great Stump. Why, the elders wouldn't let me close enough to hear what was being said."
He gave a deep bass chuckle that sounded forced.
"We can't get where we're going tonight, Aes Sedai, but every league behind us is a league we don't have to walk tomorrow. We need to be on our way."
The unshaven young man stood up, running a hand nervously along the long hilt of the sword belted at his waist, yet he made no move to pick up the scrip and blanket roll at his feet and follow as the Ogier started toward the door that led to the street, even when the Ogier said over his shoulder,
"We need to go now, Carlden."
Sashal glided fluidly into the Ogier's path, though she had to take 3 strides to his 1. "You were asking after work as a mason, Master Ladar," she said in tones brooking no nonsense. "But your hands are not as calloused as any mason's I've ever seen. It would be best for you to answer my questions." Suppressing a triumphant smile, Samitsu moved up beside the Red Sister. So, Sashal thought she could simply push her aside and ferret out what was going on, did she? The woman was in for a surprise. "You really must stay a while longer," she said to the Ogier in a low voice. The noise in the kitchen should keep anyone from overhearing, yet there was no need to take chances. "When I came to the Sun Palace, I had already heard of a young Ogier, a friend of Rand al'Thor. He left Cairhien some months past, in company with a young man named Carlden. Isn't that right, Loyal?" The Ogier's ears wilted. The young man bit off a coarse curse he should have known better than to mouth in front of sisters. "I leave when I want to leave, Aes Sedai," he said harshly, but in a low voice. For the most part he divided his gaze between her and Sashal, yet he was watchful for any of the kitchen workers who might come near. He did not wish to be overheard either. "Before I do, I want some answers. What happened to my friends? And him? Did he go mad?" Loyal sighed heavily and made a pacifying gesture with one huge hand.
"Be easy, Carlden," he murmured. "Rand wouldn't like you starting trouble with Aes Sedai. Be easy."
Carlden's scowl only deepened. It occurred to Samitsu that she could have handled this better. Those were not the eyes of a cornered fox, but a wolf. She had grown too accustomed to Dahmer and Jahar and Aben, safely bonded and tamed. That might be an overstatement, though Maurice was making an effort with Jahar. That was Maurice's way. Yet it seemed the horror of yesterday could become the complacency of today after long enough exposure. Carldin Manfor was an Ashaman too, and neither bonded nor tame. Was he embracing the male half of the power? She almost laughed. Did birds fly? Val was watching the young man with a studying frown, her hands much too still on her skirts. But Samitsu was glad not to see the light of Saidar around her. Ashaman could feel it when a woman held the power, and that might make him act precipitately. Certainly she and Samitsu together could handle him. Could they, if he already held the power? Of course they could. Of course. But it would be much better if they did not have to. Sashal certainly was making no move to take charge now, so Samitsu laid a hand lightly on his left arm. Through his coat sleeve it felt like a bar of iron. So he was as uneasy as she. As uneasy as she? Light. But Dahmer and those other two had spoiled all her instincts. He seemed sane as most men when I last saw him, she said softly, with just a slight emphasis. None of the kitchen folk were nearby, but a few had begun sneaking peeks toward the table. Loyal exhaled heavily in relief, a sound like wind rushing across the mouth of a cave, but she kept her attention on Carldin. I don't know where he is, but he was alive as of a few days ago. Alana had been close-mouthed as a muscle beyond that, and overbearing, too, with Cadsuane's note in her fist. Fedwick